All right. Let's go in here. There we go. All right. Well, once again, good evening, everyone. This is October 20th. We are in week 9 of this course and moving on through. I think after tonight, we have 5 weeks left or something like that, which is pretty crazy. I mentioned last week that I'm behind on assignments, getting assignments back or any feedback back to you on assignments. I'm still behind on that. So this week is a little bit crazy for me, so I'm hoping next week to get caught up on some of that. So just so you know, in case you're wondering why I haven't responded to your emails yet, but I will try and get to those. Well, we have quite a bit to get through this evening, so we're gonna go ahead and get started here. We've been in the Luke 15 chapter for the last 6 weeks, whatever it is, and I've really enjoyed that, really appreciated y'all's reflection and input into that. It's made it very rich. We're going to take the framework that we've built there and move now into the Old Testament this week in the Torah. So we've got 1 week to be in. We're not going to be in all 5 books. We're not going to hit a whole lot of it, but we are going to hit some today. But we're going to be in Torah today. We did do some of the writings. If we're looking at parts of the Old Testament, the book, the law, the writings, or the writings, Psalms, and we did some of that with the Good Shepherd. But then we are going to be in the prophets for 2 weeks after this, and then we'll be in the New Testament and see how the theme continues. So first, I want to start with 2 questions, kind of as we get going here. And the first, so I will want just a little feedback. The first is, if you were to say, what is the mission of God? At, at this point, either in this course or just from what you know, like what would you say? What is the mission of God? What is God about? Somebody, a couple of you, just give a response to that. Yeah, John.
Love for his creation,
Mm,
all of his creation, and then wanting us to return to him and loving him.
yeah, that's great. I love that you started with love for his creation, for everything. That's great. That's well said. Maybe one other person, just give your perspective.
Hello.
Yeah, Jesse.
Yeah. Uh, I think the mission of God for me is to redeem humanity.
Mm, it's good. It's well, that's well said. Paula.
For me, it's like I think he wants us to come to know him, and like what John said, that that way we can see his creation from his eyes. So the more we get to know him, the more we love him. I think he really wants us to be more like him, like
Yeah.
him. In turn, we would treat others the way we should and appreciate things we should.
Mm, it's good. Thank you. Doniva.
I would agree with all. I think just for us to have the blinders off of our eyes to know that we're in relationship with him and we don't have to perform in any particular way to be his children. We are already that.
Yeah. Mm. Yeah, that's all so well said. I remember being in a class, it was called Perspectives. It was a missions type course in college. And one of it was a rotating teacher type deal. So different people would come in, ministers and missionaries. And one of them asked the question, he was talking about God's heart for people. And he said, if you could hear the heartbeat of God, what would it sound like? If you could hear the heartbeat of God, what would it sound like? And then he said, people, people, people. And that's always stayed with me as what you've all said, like God's heart is for people. God's heart beats for people. It is people that God is after. So we've obviously seen that in the Luke 15 story. So what we're going to look at tonight is kind of the Old Testament story as summarized in Genesis 1 through 3, as summarized in Genesis, Exodus, in the Torah. So if you were to, step back and look at like what is the story? If you were to summarize it in a few points, what is the story in the Old Testament? You'd probably come up with something like this. And I got this more or less from the Bible Project guys, from Tim Mackey and John Collins, if any of you watch Bible Project stuff. So this is a good summary from them. God chooses a people, big story, Israel, my son Israel, chooses Israel to be a blessing to the nations. They are blessed, they're chosen, and they're chosen to be a blessing, to be a light to the nations. As the story goes, that people ends up rebelling against God, running from God, and people end up in exile, in Babylon, Assyria, the two exilic stories. We get the picture through the prophets that God goes with them into exile, right? And is seeking to redeem and promises to bring them out. And that's where, we end the Old Testament with them coming back into the land. They're kind of broken, they're kind of regathering, but there's that promise of back into the land, and then, the promise of a Messiah. So, in a short summary, that's the story. Now, if you look at that, what does that story look like? Looks like Luke 15, as a story. If you think about it here, we have two sons that are blessed, chosen. And I see your hand, Paula. I don't know if that's what you were going to say, but go ahead.
Yes, same
Yeah.
thing, yeah.
Yeah, right. Yeah, it's almost exactly the story. Two sons blessed, that's the beginning. Chosen in the sense of their sons. So Don even just said they're not something else. They're not slaves, they're not servants. They're sons, they're blessed. They leave the house in different ways. Leave the house, refuse to come in. They end up in exile in a far country, and Luke 15 makes it very clear it's a Gentile country because they're with pigs. So outside the house for the older brother, the father goes out to both of them to bring them back, and then there is the return. And to some degree, it's a question. For the older brother, it is. For the other brother, he's found. So you get this immediate picture that, okay, whatever Jesus is doing, he's telling the whole story. He's telling the story that we have in the Old Testament, and that'll become more clear tonight and as we go through the Old Testament here. Now, let's see here. What do I have here? Okay. If this is the Old Testament story, if you're thinking Old Testament, and I were to say, what is the defining event of the Old Testament? What's a couple defining events like of the Old Testament? What would you say? What things come to mind? Like what are, just kind of right off the top of your head, something big. What would you say? John.
Prophecy of Jesus.
Okay. It's good. Yep. Prophecy of Jesus. Paula.
Definitely, I will go along with what John said. I didn't think of that, but it's true. But what I see all the time is Israel, like going back to that they're constantly rebelling, and he has to redirect them all the time so that they can get to Jesus,
Yeah.
so they can ultimately fulfill what his purpose.
Yep. Right. Constant rebellion, pointing to Jesus. Anybody else have any, like if you were to say event even, like what's some defining moment in Israel's history? What would you say? Well, I will give a couple ideas here. I think we would all think if we were looking at formation of Israel, like when does it begin happening? The Exodus is a major one, right? Coming out of Egypt, because that begins this whole journey of the rebellion and the constant going back to the gods of Egypt. You know, the saying, it was easier to get Israel out of Egypt than it was to get Egypt out of Israel, because God had to do a lot of work. That wandering in the desert for 40 years was a working on trust God, trust God, trust God. So that begins that process. So the Exodus is a big one, but really a lot of commentators and scholars will say exile, right? Exile was the defining moment of Israel's history, because it is there that they are forced to kind of deal with their whole story and where they were and why. Why are they now in exile? To which the biblical account and story is, we left, we disobeyed God, and we ended up in exile. And so, even as you look now, and now that we're, you know, as far now that we're in the century that we're in and the year that we're in, and there's been the uncovering of the Dead Sea Scrolls and all these different things, we have a clearer picture that while a lot of the Old Testament books maybe were put together earlier in, the Torah, Genesis through Deuteronomy, attributed traditionally to Moses, having put together some of that, we know that at least in exile is where a lot of it was finalized. A lot of those stories were finalized. And so it is a defining period and moment of Israel's history. And we see that in some of the stories that take place, specifically tonight, even in Genesis. They are exilic type stories. If you look at Genesis 1 through 3, it's people who've been given a promise, a land, a garden, and then they're exiled from it. They find themselves in exile, just like Israel was promised promised land, and they moved in and they were there, and then they were exiled because of sin, so on and so forth. And this story is repeating. And so it's helpful, I think, to lay that out, because that does give a picture of one of the pinnacle points in their story. So we're going to look at a few of these stories. I had to make decisions on what to spend time on because we don't have a ton of time. So we're going to spend some time in Genesis 1 through 3, because it's the beginning and it's crucial, and it's an incredible story. So we're going to spend some time there, and then try and look at a few of the repeats of Genesis 1 through 3 that happen, and of this Old Testament story that happens. And then look at the Jacob story. I mentioned before that Kenneth Bailey, suggests that as one of the bigger tellings of Israel's story that Jesus is retelling when he tells Luke 15. So that's where we're going to try and get to tonight. So the story of Genesis 1 through 3, I'm going to summarize this briefly, and I'm going to have to make some assumptions tonight that we know these stories fairly well, because we don't have time to read through the whole thing. And if we did, there'd be obviously so much there that we would get stuck on. So I'm going to summarize this, and then I want us to talk about it a little bit. So we know the story that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and it begins with creation and blessing, and God says, "Good, it was good, it was good," and then He makes man, and it's very good, right? So the beginning of our story is blessing, which is really important. And John, appreciated you saying that. God loves creation. I mean, that's the first thing. Before the fall happens, that's what happens. But then we know the story. God is with man in the garden, and man, Adam, Eve, they sin, they fall. We get the fall of man, and they run from God at that point. And because of this sin, several things happen. The land is cursed, and Adam and Eve are exiled from the garden. But there is a promise that God is going to do something to deal with this problem. But that in summary, is kind of the picture. So if we were to put up the story of the Old Testament right there for Genesis, what kinds of elements from this do you see? What elements of the overall Old Testament story would you see here in just the Genesis story? And I know what you have right now is my retelling of it, but I'm trusting that you all have some of the other details in your mind. And what components of this do you see? Yeah, John.
Comparison with the prodigal son, Luke 15.
Comparison with, this is the Old Testament story comparison with Genesis story. If we take the Old Testament summary, which are these items that I mentioned as the whole Old Testament, how do you see those elements at work in Genesis 1 through 3? And then we'll talk about Luke 15. Yeah, Paula.
I agree with, John brought that up to me when he said that, the comparison, because they had it all.
Mm,
And, like he said, the comparison, when he mentioned it, I thought, well, yeah, it is true. They had it all, but they decided that they wanted more. And for that, I mean, they displeased God.
mm.
You know,
Yeah.
could have had it.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And John, you may have said more than I heard for some reason, or what other comparison to Luke 15. But yeah, that's for sure right. That they were, they're blessed and they're made in God's image, and they had everything. What else?
Well, they were sent out of the garden in Genesis 3.
Yeah. Yeah. So we have an exilic exile type picture. What about, and Paula mentioned the rebellion. What about pursuit? Does anybody see any pursuit items in there? Yeah, Paula.
Well, God did find them in the garden. I mean, I know he knew where they were, okay, but he did go after them, and he did allow them to put their side of the story, although he knew exactly what happened. But, he allowed them the opportunity to present themselves, just like the father and the prodigal, like he allowed them to listen. And of
Right.
course, he could have made the punishment much worse, but instead, he chose to do it the way that he, in his wisdom, he chose to do it. I'm sure he was disappointed.
Mm.
You fathers out there, I can't imagine how disappointed you have been sometimes. So
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. No, that's well said. The pursuit's there. We sometimes don't think about it, but the question is, from a Luke 15 telling of the story, and even just the summary, what happens? What does God do when his sheep run away? Well, he goes after them. And that's what happens here in the story. Where, Adam, where are you? Eve, where are you? And like you said, he knows where they are. I think the Hebrew word there, I've learned from others, is there's two Hebrew words for like where, for this idea, where are you? And the first is kind of like, where is it? Like, I don't know where I put it. Where are my keys? I don't know where I put them. And the second is more like, where are my keys? They should be here in this basket where I left them. Why are they not there? What has happened? And it's that more that's being asked here. Like, Adam and Eve, you were with me. Now where are you? Why are you not with me anymore? Why'd you run? Kind of thing. So it's a great picture of God at the very beginning, doing what he will do, does all the time, goes after, those who are lost. So yeah, y'all mentioned some of these. Get chosen, blessed, image of God, made in God's likeness, be fruitful and multiply. It's kind of the picture given, right? Rebellion is the fall, the running from God, exile from the garden. All of these are not in the exact, the order is slightly different, but they're all present. And then return, there's a promise of it, a promise of something being done with he will crush the serpent's head. The serpent will strike the heel, but he will crush the head. So we have this is a summary kind of story right here, just Genesis 1 through 3. So moving to comparing it to Luke 15, what I want to look at kind of each one of these themes because there's a fair amount here, right, that could be talked about. But and I know I'm asking for input and feedback, but I think it's more helpful this way. What if we start with the first one, blessing and chosenness, what similarities or differences, because there are, it's not an exact, but what similarities or differences do you see with the Luke 15 story and Genesis 1 through 3?
Yeah,
It seems to me that God was very free with the blessings,
Hmm.
um, both of his sons, and
Yeah.
also at the very beginning, he provided the garden with everything that they could possibly need. So it was like, very, they were chosen to have a deep relationship
Hmm.
and all the blessings they needed.
Yeah. Right. Yeah, that's well said.
yeah,
They
Brother
were
Ben.
made for relationship, and it's there at the beginning. Yeah, Jesse.
Yeah, what I'm seeing here is that we look at Adam and Eve in the garden, and he rebelled, and God threw him out, but he didn't just let him go,
Hmm.
but he clothed them because they were naked.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, and to compare that with Luke, seeing the prodigal child, when he
Hmm.
came back home, his father clothed him, gave him the best to wear.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Um, I had not actually noted it in that way. That's a good thought, Jesse. They both happen in a sense after the exile, so that is true. And yeah, that's really good. Yeah, thanks for bringing that out. I'm gonna comment on that because there's something else about that I was thinking, but that's really good. That's another similarity there. Anything else with blessing and chosenness? You know, um, Here we get the picture. They're made in God's image, like God. Be fruitful, multiply, like we said. Um, Subdue the earth, have dominion over it. Is the blessing given? This is all yours to take care of, to oversee. And we get the same picture in Luke 15. All I have is yours. The Father's everything. And the one thing I don't think I said when I was talking about that story is when it says the Father divided his inheritance, the word is kind of like life. So in a sense, he gives his whole life. He divides his life among them, among his sons. He gives his life to them. And we get that picture here in Genesis, which is just a tremendous, let's just say, it's a tremendous amount of freedom that God is giving here. This whole thing is yours. Now you take care of it. You know, about I think the entire Christian story is a whole lot of freedom, and it continues on with Jesus's giving us the Holy Spirit, where it's like, okay, now you have the Spirit, now you go do. It's just God is so free and generous with what He has, entrusting it to us people. But so we get that picture here. What about the rebellion? What is similar? So thinking of Adam and Eve, they there's a temptation in the garden. There's a telling, don't eat from this tree. But then there's a talking with the serpent and an exchange that happens and a desire for something. What similarities or differences do you see between that and the kinds of rebellion that take place in Luke 15 story?
It seems to me like in both instances, they're misunderstanding the heart of the Father and the heart of
Mm.
God,
Mm.
and thinking that God may be holding them back or reserving something from them.
Yeah,
And that's not the case.
right. Yeah, right. Holding something back. It's interesting. You certainly get that in Genesis 3, and then thinking about that with both the brothers, they feel like they're entitled to something. Life would be better if I got what I needed and left. Yeah, that's good. That's good. Anything else?
Yeah, brother. Ben.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm thinking on this one because when we talk about rebellion, uh, it brings experience into my mind.
Hmm.
All about experience. Like when Adam was told, "Do not eat this fruit. If you eat it, you're gonna be like one of us."
Hmm.
Okay, that's it. That was the response from Satan.
Yeah.
But God said, "Do not eat of it. Okay, if you eat it, you will surely die."
Hmm.
But then
Yeah.
Satan came in to tell him, "No, you will not surely die."
Hmm.
And so it gave him a sense of experience. Okay, let me try to experience this and see what happened.
Hmm.
But then when we go back to Luke 15, we see again this prodigal child. He said he want to go experience the world. He want to leave his father's house.
Yeah.
What would be the experience? And so when he experienced that, he got to know that he was far away. He carried himself in the far country.
Hmm.
And being in a far country is a rebellion by itself,
Yeah.
making a decision that you were not supposed to make.
Yeah. Right. Hmm. Yeah, that's good. Yeah. Thanks, Jesse. There's a kind of to the idea of what you said of experiencing. There is a Jewish interpretation of the story. In fact, I think more of the Jewish interpretation is that this is how would you say, it's more like a coming of age story in the sense of there was no question that they were going to sin. Like that's not the main question. Are they going to sin or are they not going to sin? Are they going to sin or are they not going to sin? The perspective is more like it's going to happen. So how is the response? What's the response going to be? How are they going to respond to it? Um, like we are going to grow. Like this is the journey is to, in a sense, I'm not saying this super well, but this was going to happen. It was going to be an experience. Now, how are you going to respond to that? And of course, they responded in a way that led them further away from God. But I just say that because that experience is interesting. Like they end up experiencing what it's like to be in a far country. Yeah, Sandra.
Yes, I just wanted to point out something just from a theological perspective
Mm.
with Adam and Eve with the rebellion, because I see it as they introduced sin and separation. This the way I see it, even when I was in theology. And
Mm.
then John obedience, it started to bring in the coming of Christ, but it began the process of restoring what was lost.
Yeah.
That's the point I wanted to make. And when we look at both sides, show how choice defines human relationship with God. One
Mm.
leads to rebellion and death, and the other to repentance and life. That was just a
Yeah.
point that I wanted to bring out.
Yeah. Right. No, well said. Well said. The choice and that language is used throughout the Torah, especially in Deuteronomy and Exodus. You have before you today life and death. Now choose life. Moses says to the people, like, choose to follow God because you have the option. You can choose. So yeah, no, that's good. Um, you know, it's interesting how they both, Adam and Eve, are grasping for something that they think they don't have. Like Don Eva said, they're like God's holding something back, but like the younger brother and like the older brother who both want things from God, this is like the problem from the beginning, right? This idea not seeing their father well, not knowing God, like misperceiving, but then that creating this movement towards rebellion, which is interesting because often we would just say that sin is, well, they just disobeyed God. Yes, they did, but why? Well, it seems like they misperceived what God was like from the beginning. They failed to trust that God was actually completely good, and that if there was a reason to not eat, they could trust that. So it does tie to this thing we've been talking about, and that several of you have said, perception of God matters because it mattered from the beginning. And now a lot of you've said things, but somebody said here recently, now it's this journey. Well, I think you just said it, Sandra, like this journey of now now God's work is to pursue and bring back by revealing what the Father is like, to reveal what God is like. And so we'll say a couple other things on that when we come to identity. But interesting that the rebellions are very similar. They're both grasping for something that they don't have, that they already had because they have everything, but they don't know it. I mean, it's just like, again, Jesus is brilliant with his stories, like what he's doing. Pursuit, we talked about Adam and Eve run, God pursues, God goes after, which I don't know how you all heard the story, changes the story a little bit from I heard the story growing up like God was pretty angry with what happened. So of course he's going to go hunt them down, so to speak. But from a Luke 15 perspective, and from within now, I mean, just looking at the Genesis story, you have to read that into the text because the story is God goes and finds and says, Adam, Eve, where are you? Well, we're here. We're afraid because we were naked, so we hid. And what's God's next question? Like, who told you you were naked? Like, and why is that a problem? Well, you were naked before, and that was fine. Why now? Like, why is it a problem now? There's no immediate correction right there. It's God going after saying, "Hey, we were together. What's the problem now?" You know, and it's just a good picture of the heart of God. So, some about identity here that comes in. I put sin as blindness, and we've already talked about that a little bit here. How does the sin change their view? And we don't have the text right in front of us. I could have had us pull it up, and you could be looking at it, and you can pull it up in Genesis 3. I can't get it on the screen here without messing some things up. But what happens to Adam and Eve after they sin? What kinds of identity changes happen? What kinds of things do they voice? What do you see there as it relates to identity and sin? We'll start here. It is interesting that they realize that they're naked after, and the first thing they do when they sin is run from God. And so if we were to ask the question, like I started to cover there, is God angry with them? Do they have a reason to be afraid of God? Not that we know of, because at this point in the text, it's God has made everything good, and He told them not to do something, but but at this point, there's nothing that would indicate they should run. It's interesting that sin creates that separation, and it's not on God's side. God comes after them. God still wants to be near them, but it's on their end. They feel like this need to be separate, to hide, as if something is wrong. And of course, something is wrong in the sense, but it's again not from God's end. So it brings to mind, a couple passages, Colossians 1:21 that we've mentioned before. Once Paul says, once you were alienated from God in your minds, and that's kind of the picture here. Um, it's Adam and Eve's sin that makes them perceive that God is different, that they need to run from God, and that They can't be near God. 2 Corinthians 4:4 is the God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers so that they cannot see the light of the glory of Christ. And so all of these kind of give this perspective that broken law is not just about law, right? It creates broken relationship, but not on God's end. It's on our end. And this is going to be the journey of the Old Testament to all the way to Jesus. And it's, I think, Jesus's mission, as we've talked about, like the Father that he reveals to reveal what the Father is like, because the broken law creates broken relationship. Anything that comes to mind there? Anything else anybody wants to say? Okay. Last two here. Okay. So exile, Luke 15's perspective, and I'll get you here in a second, John, emphasizes leaving the garden is the act of man. In Genesis, it's clear that God removes them from the garden. And I'm thinking of what Jesse said earlier here. One of the Jewish rabbis noted that the clothing of Adam and Eve was like a kindness to them. It's like in spite of the sin that took place, this is the kindness because they perceive that they're naked, and so God does something about it. Not because he needed to, but for Adam and Eve. And so it's a great kindness of God to clothe them. And of course, it is interesting that it's animal skins that he clothes them with. They try to clothe themselves with leaves, and it's almost like their attempts are not valid. They don't work, but God clothes them. And it's by the killing of an animal, the first death in a sense that takes place there, aside from Adam and Eve. So that's a really cool picture. I think it's also really interesting that God, when they run and hide, God does not say, no, wait. Being naked is not a problem. You don't need to worry about that. Why are you running from me? You don't need to run from me. God doesn't immediately right there try to correct. It's as if he says, okay, this is going to be a journey. He's going to do it and knows that it's going to take time. It's not the kind of thing that you can just say something and correct. It's going to be a journey now. So I'm going to say so then reconciliation is not realized, but promised with, I will crush your head. He will strike your heel. But I'm curious, as you hear all this, even the difference in the story of what exile is, Luke 15 makes it clear that it's man who leaves the garden. It's man who leaves the house. It's not the Father who pushes him out. He could have, with our knowledge of Middle Eastern culture, Jesus very easily could have inserted that, but he doesn't. He makes it very much, it is the son who leaves the house, which is different than the Genesis 3 story. So curious if you have any thoughts or comments on that or on anything at this point. Paula?
Well, mine, I just got to thinking about our human nature, how he made sure he put the angel to guard the tree,
Yeah.
knowing that they might go back because human nature, I know mine anyway, is that way where sometimes it's like, okay, I have to take 2 kicks to finally figure it out.
Yeah. Right.
So,
Yeah. No, that's right. And in that sense, if we're perceiving this from a loving God, then he knows there's a reason to not go back in yet, right? There's a reason that entering again is not good, kind of like we'll see again at Babel. There's a reason that God does what he does, and it's motivated by love. So yeah, that's good. I thought I saw I know, John, you had your hand up, but you put it down. I don't, if anybody else wants to comment. Yeah, John.
Let me start by this is deep.
Mm.
This is getting real deep. In a way, it's kind of confusing to me.
Mm.
with the comparison. I was always taught or interpreted that everything was fine in the garden. Then they ate the forbidden fruit, which was the sin on humanity, and that God broke away from them, and then eventually we would be reunited to God through Jesus dying on the cross. And I don't know. I don't know if I'm going in the wrong direction or with all this or what. It's just thrown me off a little bit.
Yeah. Well, thanks for saying that. Yeah. And I mean, I've heard that version of the story as well. I think as we're going to look at a couple other stories here real quick that may help give some clarity and guidance to that. But I think what I would say is that Jesus knew his whole Old Testament when he told this story in Luke 15. And the parallels and similarities are undeniable in the sense of obviously Jesus was thinking about the entire Old Testament story as he told that. And so his version helps give clarity and guidance to it because obviously there are different ways to read Genesis because I have heard the story before from a perspective of, we sinned and God was like, get out of here. You're done and similar. Well, I'll try and bring you back with Jesus. Um, but looking more closely at the story, that's not the case. And I think I will say as well that having some Jewish perspective on some of these things is helpful because I don't know Hebrew, and I don't know if any of us here do know Hebrew, but there's a lot in the Hebrew writings of this that, there's a ton going on and a lot of themes that are coming together. And some of what we miss, is because some that we don't know some of that. But trying to bring some of that out as it's connected to this overall story. And I mean, overall too, we know this, and this part of the point of this class, at least to say that the lens that we have does affect how we read what we see in the text, because there's different ways to see it. So we're doing the best we can. Yeah, John.
By no means at all am I doing any challenge to it.
No.
I just need to learn. It's making me realize that I need to go deeper and I need to learn and I need to look into it and learn more about it. It's something that I need to get educated more on.
Yeah.
It's just a weakness. It's a weakness of mine of not knowing the in-depth.
Yeah. No, I mean, and again, no, I appreciate you saying what you said. I was responding because I identify with you in the sense of, and I think others probably do too. And it is kind of a new way to look at it. But thanks for saying that. Man, I don't even know how 45 minutes has gone, maybe because I asked too many questions, but that's been good. But so, overall big picture here, I think I like what Baxter Kruger says in this book, Across All Worlds, is a great book on viewing the story this way, in a sense. He does a great job, but he says the great disaster of Adam and Eve was not simply that they sinned or were disobedient to the divine rule. The disaster was that in believing the lie of the evil one, they became blind. Their perception of reality became so skewed that they could no longer perceive the real truth about God or about themselves. And if you're blind, then you can't see. And now where do you go? And so in that sense, it is a disaster because now we can't see the Father clearly, which means our actions are not going to be in line with a God who loves us and is concerned about us. So I think let me just check here. From this view, with blindness entering the story, which of course Jesus, will later say, I've come to give sight to the blind, right? And not just the physically blind, but I've come to give sight to the blind. It's not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. And I think those perspectives are helpful as we think about what it means to be sinners moving forward, that there is a blindness that's present. And so in this case, sin is not something that just needs to be punished. It needs to be that won't solve the problem. It needs to be healed. It needs to be it needs to be transformed so that there can be sight. And that is the beginning of the story here. Okay, so we're going to look at a couple mini. What is interesting, and several different people have brought this out, is that the Genesis 1 through 3 story repeats, especially in the next few chapters. And Genesis 1 through 11 is kind of an introduction to the whole story, and then from there, Genesis as a whole is kind of an introduction, but 1 through 11 specifically. So, next story follows a similar pattern. You have Cain and Abel. They're both they're sons, Adam. They're blessed. They're in a garden. They're going to offer their first fruits. So we get the garden picture. There's a rebellion with Cain feeling this anger, and then end up murdering Abel. And there's exile with he's going to be a wanderer. He's going to be put out from that. But God warns him before and says, don't. Sin is trying to master you. You must not let it, right? Which is God right there, which is interesting, isn't it? Because the picture, and I had, John, what you said, I mean, I've had the same picture that God leaves them. They used to walk with God in the garden, but now they don't. But the next story is God walking with them still. God is right there talking to Cain, saying, hey, Cain, watch out. So immediately you have a story of God following, God being there with his people, which is awesome. And this continues. No explicit return, but a form of protection is put on Cain, a form of grace. So, others have noted this is almost a repeat. It's a repeating of the story of Genesis in one form. Noah, same thing happens. Flood, once we get past the flood story, which is kind of an undoing of creation, we have a recreation story. The same words from Genesis, be fruitful and multiply, is what he says to Noah. He goes out immediately. It's probably several years, but the next verse is Noah, um, rebelling, right? And there's fruit of the vine that's there. There's nakedness mentioned, and Noah gets drunk. And the result of that is a curse. He places a curse on Ham, which creates this exile situation. Another repeat story, which is crazy. You would think that there's some intention with what's happening here. Uh, but again, God is there with them. God is talking to Noah, telling Noah what to do. In spite of this, he's going to make a covenant. He makes a covenant with Noah in spite of all that's happened. And it continues. Babel's Babel's kind of like a reverse in a sense. There is the sense of like, here's this people. They're okay. They seem to be good. They're doing things, but then there is a rebellion where, oh no, I didn't update that one. I need to update that one. Picture is rebellion. The people decide to build the tower, right? And God's pursuit is to scatter them because the language is like, if they do this, they can do anything, and that's the wrong direction. If they can do anything they want and it's not stopped, that's going to lead to chaos. So that's not what God wants. So we're going to stop that. And we're going to split them up, which then leads to Abraham, and the blessing of all the nations being put there. That God is going to, through Abraham, bring a covenant that blesses the whole world. And so this would be the bigger beginning blessing story of Israel where this takes place. You'll have these in your notes. Jacob, which we'll comment on here in a minute. There's repeats of each of those themes in these stories, and then similar with Joseph in certain ways where these themes are repeated. So throughout Genesis, you get repeat little exile, blessing, exile stories. I'm going to skip this for a second and come back. Exodus, from there we move into that larger story, right? And one of the first big moments where God hears the cry, I've heard the cry, I've observed the misery of my people. The rebellion component isn't there as much, right? But this is the beginning of what the clearest picture for for Israel, for the Jewish people, of God's pursuit, that they were in exile, in slavery in Egypt, and God brought them out. I will come down and deliver them from the Egyptians, and I will bring them up to a land flowing with milk and honey. That God comes, pursues, brings them out of exile, and turns them, puts them into the land, the promised land. So these are not all exact one for one, but I hope you can see the repeated themes because they are intentional in the story. Even considering what we said, that if these stories are finally compiled during exile, then you've got, these are stories of hope, and these are stories, this is what God has done. This is how God brought us out and brought us into a promised land, and he can do it again. So in a lot of these, the return doesn't happen, but it's promised. It's promised that it's going to happen. And so you can hear that hope in this picture of a God who is always coming after his people. So we do not have a ton of time here, but I'm going back to Jacob. You know, Kenneth Bailey has an entire book. It's called Jacob and the Prodigal. And I'll put up a slide that has a couple of references to several of his books if you want to do further study in all of this. I've gotten a lot from him and from other authors, but even N.T. Wright would say that Kenneth Bailey is the authority on Luke 15, which is saying something, because that's quite a statement. So he's got a really good grasp on this story and spent a large portion of his life, I think, writing books on this in addition to other books. But I say that because it's notable if in his book he makes 51 comparisons between the Jacob and Esau story and the Luke 15 story. And that Jacob and Esau is Israel's story. And so I put up 12 of the similarities that are dramatic in both accounts with little change. So just running through, Jacob and Esau, it's a father, Isaac, with two sons. I had to make sure I got those patriarchs right. Yeah. Isaac with his two sons. One steals the blessing, takes the blessing, Jacob, and leaves quickly, right? Haste, blessing are there. Estrangement, there's separation between him and the father, but between him and his brother, especially, right? That's there. A rebellious younger brother ends up in a far country. Jacob does. The older son stays home. It's not spoken, but it's assumed that Esau stays home. Then finally, when you get to this point where Jacob is going to go out, he's going out to meet Esau. He's not going home to his father, but the estrangement is really with Esau. Then there's fear of returning on his way home. There is a lack of remorse shown. Then there is the running, falling, hugging, kissing with different tones, but it's there. And characteristics of the sons, the older son comes from the field, a young goat from the meal. So, these things are all present there. And again, that's assuming we know the story, but just because we have to go quick here. And then there's quite a few similarities that are almost opposites, right? In a sense. The mother, I didn't embolden it, but we mentioned this previously, that Rebecca is kind of like an anti-picture. She is deceptive in the story. She's not a real positive figure. Well, Jesus kind of flips that and inserts a woman into his stories, both the good woman and then the motherly aspects of the father, and kind of redeems that part of Israel's story. The divine visitation in Jacob's story is different. When he gets his name Jacob, which means Israel, there's a wrestling there. That's the divine visitation, and it's a powerful story, but it's different than the kind of incarnation that takes place in the Luke 15 story, where the father goes out to bring in and reconcile. A kiss there, in one. There's several in Jacob and Esau's story, but they can be more deceptive at points in Jacob and Esau's story, whereas in Luke 15, it's blessing and affirmation from the father. And then funny that all that you see is mine versus all that is mine is yours. That's what Jacob says to Esau when he meets him. All that you see, or Esau says that all that you see is mine here, and he shares some of it with him, but it's a difference in the story. So that's just a few. You will have this as a handout. Again, I think overall, the reason for saying that, and John, I see you, I know I'll go back to that slide, but just want to summarize this, is if Luke 15 is a retelling of Israel's whole story, of the Old Testament story of Jacob and Esau, which others smarter than myself have said, then it's an important parable. And there is a reason that we're spending a class on it and spending time looking at it so much because it's Jesus was doing something really special with the story. Yeah, John.
Brother Ben,
Mm-hmm.
I'm feeling uncomfortable.
Mm.
I'm feeling uncomfortable like a fish out of water. And now I'm contemplating things, and it's almost like the enemy is trying to attack me with confusion.
Mm.
Just mention about the separation from God from sin. But then I'm thinking, God is always with us, no matter what. He never leaves us. He's always with us. So, I mean, I just feel like something's going on with almost like an attack,
Mm.
of confusion right now. And as a matter of fact, I feel like I'm going to go ahead and look at the YouTube video again,
Mm.
because my mind was focused more on this than the lesson, and I just feel that right now. So
Yeah. Well, that's
I apologize to everyone for that. I apologize to y'all.
no, John, not at all. Not at all. That is okay. And I'd be happy to chat with you, have a phone call with you at any point if you want to talk through some of after you've listened through it again and want to talk through any of it. Um, I admit it's a lot of information in one class, and I'm sorry about that. I couldn't find another way to do it. And so I know there may be a lot of new things and a lot of things there, but I'd be happy to visit with you. But
No,
know
brother,
that that's okay.
it
Like,
does, it doesn't have anything to do with the way you taught, but
yeah,
it's
no,
just I feel like there's something going on here with confusion, and like I said, I feel like the enemy's trying to be an attack.
yeah, yeah. Well, appreciate you sharing that. And like I said, love to visit with you at some point too about that and just be at peace through that, knowing it's okay that, when these new things come and there is that confusion, it can create that. But yeah, we can talk. But Doniva, I see you're
I'll email you and schedule a time.
okay. Yeah.
I just want to quickly say that to John that I can assure you you're not the only one who is struggling a bit, but I don't see that as a negative thing. I think it's more maybe we're ready to open our eyes a bit. And I wanted to mention something I've been hearing lately, and I may be um, off the mark a bit, but I am hearing people who show the difference between reading literally, which
Mm.
I know is what I was taught to do with the Bible. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but with what you're sharing with us, they were saying the possibility or the benefit of reading literarily.
Mm. Yeah.
And so it seems like you're having us dig in deeper and see things that we would never see just reading literally, just picking up the facts and trying to memorize those facts.
Mm.
You're taking the time to help me see that
Absolutely.
literally I can dig in and see much more repeated stories through all of the Old Testament. So
Mm.
anyway, I may be off, but I think there's something that we can learn more than only reading literally.
Mm.
Very well said. Very well said.
Yeah. Yeah, that is. Thank you, Doniva. Yeah, no, all that's really good. And yes, just to echo that, the there are there are some good resources of people saying some of this and explaining it well. And I'd be happy to give a couple of those. There was a recent seminar at LCU, Lubbock Christian University here in Lubbock. They brought in a professor and he did something on Genesis 1. He talks a lot about reading literarily. It's not this Luke 15 picture, and like he's not going that direction, but he's really good on that and the whole lens thing. So I mean, saying exactly what you said, Doniva. So that's really good. And then there's a podcast that is actually fantastic, and it's more from a Jewish perspective, Jewish Christian perspective, and it is so good and helpful. And they go straight through these stories and bring a lot of this out. And so I'd be happy to make those resources available, and I'll try and put them in an email, and they're there for the taking. You also don't have to, of course, but they can be helpful. But to close and give a theme, if Jacob's story is a story that is central, and it is, I mean, there's no denying that it's central to Israel's story, and central to the whole, we're talking about similarities in the whole Old Testament story. Well, right in the middle of that is Jacob wrestling with God. And I think for whatever reason, it happens more in our Western culture that the idea of wrestling with God is not always a positive thing. It's not always portrayed positively. But it is what our fathers did, fathers and mothers, saying, God, this is not okay. I don't understand this. I'm not okay. And so, I think that's a fitting end to say Jacob did, and Abraham did, and Moses did, and Job, and all these others of God. We're not okay with what we see. We don't understand what we see. We're going to wrestle. And so that's an okay place to be. And that's a biblical and good place to be. And it's hard sometimes, and not a place we always want to be. But it's good, and it's right here in the story. So thank you all. Thanks for sharing that. Let me see what I have here. Yeah, closing quote from Baxter Kruger: reconciliation, the beginning of this journey now in the Old Testament, moving God forward, or God moving us forward towards reconciliation, towards Jesus. Reconciliation is about the Son, Jesus, crossing all the worlds of our confusion and blindness and darkness to establish relationship with us inside our darkness, so that our fallen minds can know the Father and live. And we think if there's anything Jesus was doing with his story, it was trying to give as clear a picture of the Father as he could within the darkness of the world, within the confines of the world that he was in. And I love that quote, because that's God's direction with us. So next week we'll continue. We're going to jump to Jonah, which is a long jump from where we are, but we need to just to move. And it's Jonah's one of my favorite books in the whole Bible. And it's just incredible, especially as it relates to what we're talking about. So I hope you guys can be on for that, so we can have more discussion. Thank you. Let me close this with prayer, and then we can be done. Father, thank you for your word. Thank you for what you've given us, and for your heart for people. Help us to see that heart even beating for ourselves as you pursue us and bring us to yourself, and give us greater clarity and open our eyes, Holy Spirit, to see you more clearly and to know you more deeply. We thank you in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Thanks, everyone. Email me if you have any
Good night,
questions.
everyone.
If you need anything else. Thanks.
Brother Ben, thank you.
Thank you. Mhm.
Thank you.